Welcome to the Vibrant Life Show. This show is all about exploring the purposes God has placed in our lives and the passion He's placed in our hearts to reach the community He's placed us in for such a time as this. So whether we're hearing stories of those living out their purposes, helping you craft your passions and gifts, asking hard questions, or leaning into cultural moments, the purpose of this show is to remind us that the life that we are created to live is an adventurous one, a meaningful one, a purposeful one. We are invited to live the vibrant life. Well, hi, everyone. I am your host, Gentry, and welcome to the Vibrant Life Show. And actually, we are jumping in this week to part 2 of a conversation with my friend, Hannah Gronowski Barnett. So if you missed the first one, we're on podcast, we're on YouTube, so you can go look up the Vibrant Life Show on any platform that you listen to, and I highly recommend listening to that one as well whenever you can. But we're going to be diving into that same conversation today, but in more depth of how do we not only reach the next generation and who they're called to be, but also even ourselves. Like, what is God, this discovering the wrong that we were born to make right, which is something that Hannah says often. How do we actually implement that in our lives and the steps that we can take to do that? So to talk about it, Hannah, welcome back to the Vibrant Life Show.
I'm so honored. Round 2, let's go.
Round 2, okay. Well, Hannah is not only a dear friend of mine, but she is an author, a speaker, a CEO of Generation Distinct, and among many other things as well. And so she has a lot of knowledge in so much of this area, but God has anointed her voice to speak into not only this generation, but the next. And so I'm just honored always to have her here to be talking about this. And Hannah wrote this book, Generation Distinct. And again, I'll link to all of this in the show notes. And I highly recommend you buy this, go into it, especially because we are called to discipleship, and to really pour into the lives of those around us. And so I want to actually touch on discipleship. Yeah. But first, if I know that the first one, if you really want to know a lot about Hannah, go listen to the first one because we got things to do.
That's right.
No, but Hannah, tell just people a little bit about you again, and then we'll jump into it.
Yes, Hannah Gronowski Barnett. I've been married to my amazing husband, Aaron Barnett, for 3.5 months.
Which I had the honor of standing next to and witnessing.
She did.
What a blessing.
The best times. It was so sweet. From the best city in the world, Chicago, and I'm the CEO and founder of a nonprofit called Generation Distinct. I'm also a speaker, author, podcast host, and coach.
Yes, and her podcast is also Generation Distinct as well, and then she has a YouTube channel as well. So I mean, we will link to all of those things because Hannah, your voice is so critical at this time in history.
Thank you.
And one thing that you're very passionate about is discipleship. So why discipleship? What is it, and why are you so passionate about it?
You know, I'm a very practical, logical person, and I don't think I come off that way, but the way my brain works, it's very, very systematic. If somebody tells me something's a good idea, and I think it is, I have to agree. But if I think it is too, then I'll pretty much go out and do it. And when I was 17 years old, I was going to a church where they talked a lot about this idea of discipleship or mentorship. They called it mentorship. Mentorship, discipleship, very, very similar ideas. And they were talking about how, I remember where I was in the adults midweek gathering. I was 17. I was not really supposed to be there, but I wanted to be there because I loved being challenged. And the executive pastor, his name is Tommy Bowman, a really great friend of mine. He got up on stage and he said, hey, Jesus had his 12 and he had his 3. And so you guys all need to figure out who are your 12 and who are your 3 that you're investing in. And he broke it down so well. And it was just so clear. If we look at the life of Jesus, he literally he was the only individual in all of history who could have supernaturally had the capacity to impact everybody at the same exact level. Wow. Right? I mean, he was fully God. Yes, he was fully man, but he was also fully God. And yet, in humility, he chose to model for us what it would look like to have a specific group that he did life with. Mm-hmm. He invited 12 young men to follow after him for 3 years. And then even amongst the 12, he had 3 that had really, really deep access to some of his emotional moments, right? And he did not do that for 1,000 people. That was not the size of a church body. That was not the size of an Instagram following. That was the size of an inner circle.
Right.
And so he broke that down for me, our pastor. And so at 17, I said, okay, well, I should probably be doing this too, obviously, right? And so I literally remember writing down 3 names. I started with, okay, I'll find my 3 first. I wrote down 3 names, and they were middle schoolers that were in my church. So I thought, if I'm in high school, I should probably find middle schoolers because I have to find somebody who's younger than me. And so they were too young to even like ask them myself. So I emailed their parents and I said, hey, can I take your daughters out for coffee? Yeah. I think I'm supposed to like just, I don't know, do this mentorship thing with them, you know? And so long story short, I started doing that. It began to grow. And I ended up with like a group of 8 young women that I walked with from when they were about 5th and 6th graders all the way through. Now they're seniors in high school, and some of them just went off to college. And it was so sweet. I had them as my junior bridesmaids in my wedding a few months ago. And I just... it sounds weird, but the reason I believe in it is because Jesus did it and because it works.
Yeah.
There's been no more fruitful part of my ministry, none, than discipling these 8 young women and seeing them come to know their identity in Jesus, who Jesus is for himself, what their purpose is. And it's not a formula. There was no formula that I used. I didn't use a curriculum, but I just gave 8 young women almost full access to my life.
Wow. To
say, hey, if I'm traveling somewhere, if I'm speaking somewhere, if you want to come with me, I would invite them into Gen D projects sometimes, Generation Distinct projects. I would invite them, if I had to run errands, but I was really busy one day, I would go to like Target and be like, hey, you want to come shopping with me? If I was, I've had, now that I, live with my husband in the city, they'll come down and they'll sit in my little family room while my husband's doing laundry, and they'll ask us both questions. And it has just been the most beautiful part. It's also been the hardest part. I mean, that's the moments when I've held their hands as they've shared about suicide attempts and cutting, or the moments when their parents were going through a divorce, or the moments when one of their friends at school, was experiencing abuse, and how do they handle that? I was with a girl who recalled for the first time the abuse of her childhood, and she never reconciled it until that point. And they're crying as they're saying, I've never told anyone any of this before. And so it's not that it's this like flowery, beautiful, perfect, we're reading the Bible as the sun rises every day together, but it's this very pure life on life. Follow me, as Paul said, follow me as I follow Jesus. It's so simple. And I think it's one of the missing pieces in our world today.
That's what I wanted to hit on, because I do feel as if this generation, I'm a millennial, and you're like cusper.
I call myself a zillennial.
Yeah, you're a zillennial. Whichever one's more convenient for the day. But I feel like we're wanting people to pour into us. And then I'm wondering too, why there's a gap there with discipleship that's happened in the previous years, but there's also, I believe, a deep desire for it to be happening.
Yes.
And so what is that? What do you feel like in the church's what's keeping us? What are you seeing when it's like, why are we not? How do we bridge that gap to like really move back into like, whether it's social media, whether it's the layout of the church in our day, generations being about, what do you think are those maybe some little stuff that we can lean into for a moment of why we're not doing it?
Yes. It's something we cannot outsource. There's no way for us to streamline it. We can't automate it.
Come on.
And it's really inconvenient. So when my girls were...
Can I just say, Hannah, I almost fell over in my chair in the studio if you're not watching, because we cannot outsource discipleship when we live in a world of complete outsourcing everything. And it's inconvenient and it's time consuming.
Yep. Right. And we can't automate it.
And so she just stepped on some toes, probably my own. That's why I almost fell on my chair and lost my headphones for a second. So continue. There was a girl, but I just had to stop because that was very powerful. So I needed to stop there. So continue on their story.
Thank you. Yeah. And, when it's always funny. I kind of talk about them like they're my children sometimes because I watched them grow up for 7-8 years now. But as my girls were growing up, most of them had a lot of extracurricular activities after school. And so usually the only time to meet with them, if I wanted to have like an actual coffee with them, would be in the mornings before school. And so and they couldn't drive yet. And so I would drive to their house and I would pick them up. I would take them to Starbucks. We'd meet for about an hour, and then I'd drop them off at school, and they had to get dropped off at like 7:30. And so, there was a season where I was doing that maybe like 3 mornings a week with different of my girls. And so I was exhausted in many ways, and it was so inconvenient. And honestly, it was a season where and that's not every season. This season that I'm in right now, they're mostly free after, so that's great. But that was a season. And I remember looking at other people and seeing that they had these perfect morning routines. And they would go to the gym in the morning, and they would drink their coffee, and they would read their Bibles, and they would, shower in the morning. And I would be like, and I talk about this in my book, I literally slam my alarm at 5 a.m. and I throw my glass on my face. I'm like fumbling around for shoes, and I end up wearing 2 different ones. Like literally I would show up sometimes discipling these girls in like 2 different shoes. So I was so tired. And I would like get there. My hair was a mess. I had no makeup on. And then I would get home after discipling them and be like, man, I haven't even done any of like my stuff. And now I feel so behind. And it was this, I had to like deprogram myself to believe that I was actually like not stewarding my mornings well because I wasn't having the perfect routine, when in reality I was sacrificing that so that I could have space in my life to disciple, so that those young women one day would also go on to disciple people and know that sometimes it's a sacrifice.
That's so good. It's worship.
It's worship.
Because the truest form of worship is costly.
Yes.
It's sacrifice. Yes. And that is what you're doing. I love that you're touching on this right now, because I think there's a lot of people who feel like you have to have this cookie cutter routine.
Right.
And that not only goes into our morning routine, but also in the way that we disciple.
Yes. Yes.
And so how that is different, because what you're saying is a little bit different than the way that I've been pouring into the people behind me and even my mentors into my life. It doesn't look the same. And actually, I'm not even in the same city as some of my mentors.
Right.
But how we stay in contact, how we do life.
Yes.
It's not a cookie cutter, but it is required.
Yes.
Like,
so
do you feel like discipleship is an option?
No. Absolutely not. The thing is that we miss out on is that when Jesus went back to heaven, his last words, which we all care about people's last words, right? Like his last words were go out and make disciples. It was not go out and preach really good messages. It wasn't even write good books. And it wasn't even figure out what your passion is. His last words were go out and make disciples of all nations. And so it's really sad to me that so many of us are missing out on the most beautiful essence of what Jesus wanted us to do.
Right.
And I think you would agree with this too. I don't feel like we connect with Jesus any better than when we're doing the exact command that he asked us to do, which is the Great Commission. Another thing I want to say is when it comes to so many of us freak out, we don't know, man, what's our passion? What are we supposed to do with our lives? But we forget that what we need to do until God tells us the next thing is do the last thing he told us to do.
Yep.
And the last thing he told us to do was go out and make disciples. So if somebody's listening to this and they're like, I don't know what to do, I feel like my life isn't having meaning, it's really easy. You find at least one person that's a slightly earlier session or earlier season of following Jesus, and you say, do you want to do life with me? And maybe it's on Zoom, right? I have a couple girls now that I'm discipling on Zoom. They're not in my cities. Or maybe it's you're going out to Starbucks. Mm-hmm. But it can start now. And my pastor today, his name is Chris Carmona. He's in the city of Chicago. He says this awesome phrase I love, that life moves at the speed of relationships. Your life will get bigger when you invest in the relationships, especially relationships that you're not getting anything out of, but that you're investing into. I'm curious, Allie, you said you did not grow up just like having all these voices around you naturally, right?
Yeah.
How did you then figure out that you were called to discipleship?
Yeah, and I'll answer that. And so if you're just joining us, this is the Vibrant Life Show, and I am Allie Gentry with Hannah Gronowski Barnett, and we're now co-hosting the show today. And we're talking about discipleship and even passion. Like, how does that, out of discipleship, how do we discover our passions? Because I think that the word passion is a little bit misused, especially in the church.
Yes.
I've been guilty of it myself.
Me too.
But I would say, to your question of discipleship, there were people who invested in me. So my father is not only my lead pastor, but he was also my youth pastor at the time.
Wow.
And so when people are asking, like, who's this person that's had the most like impact on your life? Obviously, my mother as well, because they're a team. But my dad in leadership roles, because he was my youth pastor and then he was my lead pastor. Okay, and he's my father. So I like have like he just, and I knew he believed in me. I knew that he wanted the best for me. But I also had other people like Sunday school teachers and all that. But I never had anyone really pull me aside and say, hey, I want to pour into you. And actually, what I can remember is a lot of times the people who would pull other people aside because they had maybe a different connection with them. But I was like, hey, they believe in them, but why don't they believe in me? Wow. So I started to actually doubt myself, my call, my purpose, and say maybe that I just don't have what everybody else is having. Like maybe they see something in those people that I don't have. Yes. And that actually messed with my head quite a bit because also, you have teenage hormones and all of there, so I'm not putting that on everyone else. Let me just say this. And so I was like, oh, nobody likes me. Okay, so I get it. I needed to get over myself, but come on, I was 15. I'm already emotional as a 32-year-old, so don't imagine me at 15 because I was a disaster. But anyways, so Lord bless anybody who is in any type of leadership over me. But the thing is that I didn't feel like anybody really believed in me. They didn't take time out of their schedule really to invest because my father was my youth pastor, but he was my father, so he was investing in me, and so was my mother, and so it wasn't until I got older, like I literally even moving into my passion, like when I started to to see it and to see what I was maybe created for, and to step into these spaces and be like, wow, I feel like I'm called to do this. Now, how do I do it? I didn't even have mentors to help me. I was looking around like, who outside of my dad is going to help me live into the call that is on my life? And I'm just like, Holy Spirit, you're my mentor. The people in Scripture were my mentor. Like I just went to the Scriptures and said, I'm going to sit at the feet of today David. Like, how did he lead? How did he speak? How are these people? And so I did that, and then I started to pray for people because I didn't know at that point that I need to start praying and being on the lookout. So I started praying for 2 people behind me and 2 people ahead of me. So the people ahead of me, I have 2 people, one person that speaks into my life vocationally and one person that speaks into my life really for life things, who does similar stuff, but really more life. And I just want to tell people, like, if you don't have those people, start praying for them, because sometimes it takes a moment, but then you'll be more aware of what you've been praying for and you can see it, but you also have to go out of your comfort zone to ask.
Yes. Come on.
Because some people need to know that you want them to do it.
It is our job. Talk about it, girl.
Yeah. And so that was a huge deal for me. Not only did I need to ask, because the girls that I mentored, like, they were coming and asking me, do you have time? And I was like so convicted by it, because I was like, I'm not asking anyone to do it for me.
That's so good.
So they actually taught me how to ask. So I did this whole thing backwards. So when I hear you and I hear like how you were like, God has created your path of like having that discipleship and has given you such a desire to help other people in that. It's so beautiful because you've experienced the beauty of it. And I feel like I have a passion of it because I've experienced the lack of.
It's so real. And that's the beauty, that there is no one size fits all, right? There's no one size fits all to how we understand what we're created for. And yet there is beauty in the difference, right? Because you're going to bring something to those women that I would never bring, right? And I love that you touched on the idea that you asked them, because I grew up with parents that, and I love, this is my favorite things looking back, they always said to me, but whenever my siblings and I would come to them with something that we didn't think was fair or okay, in all love and kindness, they would be like, well, it's not about you, you know? And I remember there would be moments where we're like, well, no one sits by us at lunch and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, well, are you getting up and sitting by them? And they would always turn it back on us to own our lives. And I think we don't have a generation that's owning our lives very well. I think we're really, really expectant that people are going to give us what we want. And I think in every part of life, I think when it comes to the mentors we want, the impact we want to have, and the community, the tribe around us, none of those are your pastor's job. None of those are your church's job. None of those are the world's job. And none of those are God's job. Like, God has already given you everything you need to open your mouth and ask somebody to speak into your life.
Right.
He's already given you everything you need to invite friends to join you in life. He's already given you everything you need to create the impact that he has created you to make.
Yeah. And I actually think too, on that point, as a local church leader, there's a lot of people who have left because they're like, well, there's not, nobody sees me and there's not a space for me. And I will say that does happen because as I've walked in by myself to other churches, like even over my sabbatical, and I'm like, like, you know, like, or those types of things. So I understand that there's real situations, but also like, what are you doing to try and be involved? And I love how it turns back on us to give ownership, because what you talk in your book, the first step is own your potential. That's the first movement is like own your potential. And then it moves into the passion. That's right. Crafting your passion. Is that correct?
That's right.
And then the third thing, finding your people. Finding. So this is action.
Yes.
And then live distinct. Yes. And this is an action. So like I even on the passion piece, I want to go back to what you said about discipleship really quickly, because so many people are like, well, I don't know what my passion is. And I've heard this quite a bit. Like, what's my passion? But what was beautiful is that you said, like, we're called to do discipleship. And when we do it, a lot of times it's in the doing that we become passionate. About it, because we see the fruit of it.
That's it. It is in the doing. And I believe Jesus is the most strategic individual who has ever existed. I don't think we talk about that a lot. We talk about him as a really, really good God and Father and all these things. He's brilliant. Jesus is brilliant. He's the wisest. I mean, he's God. He knows all. So he's brilliant. He's strategic. So when Jesus told us to go out and make disciples, and that was the last thing he gave us, I believe it's because he knew that everything flows out of that. Mm-hmm. Me investing in my 8 young women, I believe, is directly one of the reasons why I was able to at such an early age, understand that my call was to unleash the potential in the next generation of leaders, was because I would sit with these middle schoolers who were already passionate and dreaming and big, and I would have the conversations with them, and I would recognize when my heart would start beating faster. I would recognize when I would get excited. I would recognize what made my voice grow louder. I am so convinced time after time after time that Jesus is not going to reveal our passions to us when we're sitting at home watching Netflix, while we're scrolling through Instagram again, we're, even going through the clearance rack at our favorite store looking for something to fill our needs, when we're sitting in a bar with our friends complaining about our lack of passion. He's going to do it when we're in the midst of relationship, we're in the midst of the injustice, when we're in the midst of doing things that line up with who he is and what he has already said he wants the world to look like. When we're partnering with him already, those are the moments I think he taps us on the shoulder and says, hey, that was it. Yeah. What you just heard, what you just felt, what you just saw and experienced, that was the wrong you were born to make right. It's in the doing, but it's inconvenient to do it first, because we're not going to have a plan. We're not going to know when it's going to happen, but we've got to trust God to say, I'm going to start doing, and when you're ready to tell me, then I'll say yes.
Yeah, and to your point, when I discovered that I was actually supposed to speak, I was coaching full-time at a high school that happened to be a Christian high school. So I was able to pour into them, and I was like doing devotions and all this stuff. And then I got to speak at our chapel, and I had never spoken necessarily publicly like that. And when I did it, I was like, the heart rate, like not in like a, oh my gosh, I have to speak type of thing, because that is a real life thing. But like where it was like a thin layer between us and heaven, where it was like, oh, I never had felt closer to God when I was doing it. And I was like, I remember calling my parents and I said, I think I just discovered what I'm supposed to do with my life, because I've never felt this. And it was when I was pouring into the next generation. And it's not that everybody's looks like that. You might be a mom and you're like, what's my purpose? What's my passion? Disciple your children. If you're a father, disciple your children. If there's no one else yet, guess what? That's the next generation, and is the very arrows that will take out the enemy in the years after we're gone. That's right. And so that's the beauty of it. But also by doing things, you also know what is not your thing.
Yes.
Because I've discovered that too, and that is huge.
There's freedom in that.
Yes, and that's the beauty of what you were talking about on the last show of that whiteboard. Like you need to do what you are created and called to do, and that's going to connect with other people who are doing it. We don't have to be competing or comparing, because we're all out here trying to make disciples of all nations. Right.
I'll give a quick example. One of the young women that I've been discipling for about 5 years is a Team USA weightlifter. She's going towards the Olympics. She is now having a platform to speak to athletes around the world, and she is preaching the gospel to a secular group that I would never, ever reach. But because I've spent time with her in the private places, now she's equipped to reach people group I will never reach. That's why discipleship matters right there.
That is exactly it, and it's imperative for us to live. I actually think that going back to the vibrant life, the abundant life, when we do this and we're pouring into other people, if you're feeling dead somewhere in your heart right now, and you're like, what is this vibrant life? I want it. Find someone and pour into them and give yourself away, and in that you will find abundant life. In Jesus' name. Hannah, we're so grateful to have you again. Again, we'll link to how we can connect with you and Instagram, Hannah Gronowski. We'll link to the website as well. But we just want to say thank you. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you so much.
You're such a blessing. And every day is an invitation to live the vibrant life. Thank you for joining me on the Vibrant Life Show. I would love to connect with you and get to know you. My favorite place to hang out is over on Instagram at allie.gentry or over on Facebook. You can also go to my website, alliegentry.com. That's ALIGENTRY.com. Sign up for my newsletter to stay up to date and get links to the show on all platforms after we air, the show's YouTube channel, and really just all the things. I am so honored to get to hang out with you today. My heart is that you remember that each day is an invitation to live the vibrant life.